I also got to experience myself in this really, really healthy dynamic with this couple, with a man and a woman. And that dynamic actually helped me realize that I didn't want polyamory at all. It's funny, it wasn't the problematic dynamic that did it. It was actually the wonderful dynamic that did it, because I said to myself at the end of it, if this is the best that it can be, and this is amazing, why do I still feel like it's actually not for me? When I picture the version of love that actually makes me feel anchored, it's not a life of constant negotiation with multiple partners. It's not trying to pretend that jealousy is somehow a base, brute emotion that I'm meant to bludgeon out of me through exposure. I realize that I'm not a person who wants to obliterate hierarchy, that I actually want to be the number one person in somebody's life as a non-negotiable.
Hi everyone, welcome to Polycurious, the show for those curious about non-monogamy. I am Fair, your host, and also a relationship coach. And today we're talking about BDSM. If you've ever been curious about dominance and submission, I think you're going to get a lot out of this episode, because we not only talk about what it is and even how you could even tune into those parts of yourselves. I think especially as women, we have a hard time tuning into our dominant self. But also we talk about the therapeutic benefits, the potential therapeutic benefits of BDSM. And my guest today, Nicolle Hodges, is actually writing a book on this very subject. And she has experience both being a lifestyle dominatrix, and we get to talk about her personal journey getting into that, and also as a submissive in her personal life. So after Nicolle tells us how she kind of fell into becoming a dominatrix and how she kind of felt like it was her calling to actually do so, she tells us about her non-monogamous journey. And even though she's still in the BDSM world, she's actually decided to step away from non-monogamy after her last relationship. And she tells us why. And honestly, I love interviewing people who have tried non-monogamy and realized it wasn't for them, because I do not think that it is for everyone. And I think it comes with a lot of trade-offs. And even myself, at this moment in my life, I'm questioning if that's something that I truly want. And Nicolle shares a lot of really great points. I think in her case, the reason why she started exploring non-monogamy was precisely because she was a dominatrix when she met her last partner. And because she didn't want to give up that part of herself, they opened the relationship up. But ultimately, Nicolle realized that it just isn't for her. The amount of conversations, scheduling, managing jealousy, and all of those things just felt like too much for her. And also she realized that she was actually using non-monogamy as a way to maybe fill some gaps in her relationship that had she not been non-monogamous, she couldn't have been able to ignore. And I find this fascinating because, yes, there's nothing wrong with meeting different needs by different people, but sometimes those needs can be core needs, right? That you need in every single relationship. And because you're getting it in one, you might actually kind of neglect the work that the other one needs to also get that need met. But that wasn't her only reason. And we get to talk about how she sees her relationship today. And even though they're monogamous, they have the freedom to speak about their desire for other people. And she was really inspired by this book called The New Monogamy, which I will make sure to link in the show notes in case you are curious to check out. But basically, even if you are doing monogamy, you don't necessarily need to follow the script. You can still talk to your partner about your desires and how you might want to design your relationship. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in that concept. And also to check out Nicolle's Substack, where she also talks about BDSM and several topics that we discussed today. It used to be called The Sexual Freedom Philosopher, but she's recently changed the name to Both Sides of the Slash. And she's a very intelligent writer. So I highly recommend that you go and check that out. And also, if you want to connect with her, follow her on Instagram at Nicolle. Her book, unfortunately, is not out yet, but I will make sure to add the link as soon as it's out. So if you are watching or listening in the future, the link might already be there. And if not, go over to Nicolle's Instagram. Again, that's Nicolle to stay tuned for when her book comes out. Okay, guys, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Here is my interview with the amazing Nicolle Hodges. Nicolle, I'm so happy to talk to you. I think that we've been loosely in touch for years now. I think that the first time that we actually connected was because we were both going to go to Wonderland, a psychedelic conference. And then I saw you again in New York at a house party, and I've been following your Instagram and your work. So I'm super excited to have this conversation with you.
Me too. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, of course. I won't attempt to introduce you because I feel like you have like 5 different things that you are doing. So I'm going to give you the floor to explain to everyone what you're up to, which I think it's awesome that your work covers a little bit of everything. You know, you are in the psychedelic space, BDSM, and, you know, some other things. So I'll leave it up to you to tell the listeners who you are.
Thank you. I recently came across a word the other day of multi-passionate, and I thought, okay, that really works. And I don't know if you know the mantra, or not the mantra, the slogan, the term, whatever, that goes jack of all trades, master of none. But the second half of that is oftentimes better than a master of one. And that makes me feel a lot of comfort, because I don't know if anyone else relates to this, but sometimes loving so many things at once, it seems that your attention is pulled in all these directions and you want to do it all, and life suddenly seems so short and the days even shorter to get it all done. But if I could try to synthesize what it is that I do, I often create and play right at the edges of culture. As a journalist, my specialty is in disruptive markets. So I was at the forefront of reporting on cannabis legalization in Canada, primarily helping to craft some of the earliest educational content to change public perception around cannabis. I then moved into psychedelics and did a lot of psychedelic journalism, reporting on how psychedelics was impacting culture. Then I moved into cryptocurrency and blockchain. And then in many ways now my focus is on human sexuality, and specifically kink and BDSM. So exploring the therapeutic potential of BDSM, as well as how BDSM can have a positive impact on your life in making you a better leader and a better lover. Then I also have a focus on masculinity and have been doing a project for the last 10 years called Men Who Take Baths, where I've been documenting, well, almost 10 years, I've been documenting the evolution of masculinity in a post-Me Too world, you can call it. So since 2017, I've been putting men in bubble baths and interviewing them about what it means to be a man as a way to document the changing psychology and male identity of the, quote, modern man. And so that's been a really important project for me as well. Also, obviously, a lot of fun. And then, other than that, other than those 2 main projects, I would say I primarily identify as a writer, director, producer, content creator. Again, kind of always poking at the edges or poking at the taboo. So my Substack, I know we'll kind of get into this, but if anybody wants to follow my Substack, it's The Sexual Freedom Philosopher, which is where I really dive into all of these things. From a personal perspective, I know we're going to talk about this too. My exploration of polyamory and then my return to monogamy, I write about as well. In many ways, I treat my life like an experiment.
Yeah. I identify with a lot of what you're saying. I also studied journalism. Now I'm a relationship coach and a podcast producer, and people are kind of like, oh, wait, you're both things that don't seem to be related to one another. And I have a lot of different interests, maybe not as many as you do, but I identify with that, curiosity of life that I think probably led us to study journalism and get into different worlds and learn different things. However, for the purpose of this conversation, I think we're going to focus on BDSM, on non-monogamy. So let's start maybe with BDSM, because I know that you were for a time a lifestyle dom, which I would also like you to explain a little bit what that is. But where did your interest for that come from? Because I find that as a society, and that's another thing I want to talk to you about, we women are not encouraged to be dominant, right? It's quite the opposite. So even as someone like myself who is interested in exploring kink, in exploring different dynamics, I've always been more of a sub. And the moments where I've tried to explore or wanting to explore what it's like to be a dom, or not a dom, but dominant as a woman sexually, is not something that there's really much education about. It's not something that you really like, that it's like easy to even try out, right? So how did your personal interest start on this subject? How did you even realize that was a thing that you enjoyed or wanted to try out?
I was 28 years old when it even came into my sphere of awareness, and it was by accident. Throughout my life, I always found myself naturally in leadership roles, starting with being the oldest sister of two younger brothers, growing up in quite a violent household with quite a mercurial mother, and needing to, in many ways, step into a parental role quite early on. As my journey through BDSM continued, I did realize in some ways that there were parts of myself that I was rejecting. And I actually did find that when I went and explored submission. So I've been on both sides. But in terms of dominance, older sister, tended to be, captain of teams in high school, tended to rise quite quickly in any organization that I was a part of into a leadership role. And so I feel these things came quite naturally to me. But I describe it in the book as well as wandering down the hallway of my mind, opening up all these doors, trying to find the thing that seemed to be missing. This energy inside of me that no matter how many leadership roles I found myself in, it was like I couldn't quite reach or fill this longing that I had for something more. And it was through a bad date and an accidental text. I went on a date with a man, and I could usually get a sense of the man pretty quickly as to whether I was interested in him or if he was interested in me, so on and so forth. And with this one particular man, it was like he was covered in a gray fog, and I couldn't get a read. And, we went on a couple of dates, and by the end of, I think it was the third date, he hadn't tried to kiss me, even though we were on our third date. And I was like, okay, this isn't going anywhere. This isn't working. And so I sent him a text when I got inside and was like, hey, this isn't going anywhere. And he kind of gave me a lukewarm response, like, oh, okay, that's fine. And I sent my friend a text and I said, please don't throw shade at me, okay? This was a long time ago. But I was like, I finally got rid of that guy. I'm pretty sure he's gay and just doesn't know it. But I accidentally sent that text to him. And, the little ellipses pop up to show that he's typing. And I'm kind of sitting there and I'm going, you know what? Like, you're such an asshole for saying this. Like, whatever this man says back to you, you completely deserve. So I was in a really open space, and he sent back 2 words. And those 2 words in many ways changed the direction of my life. And he said, go on. And I have no idea why, but it was like all these gears had been shifting in my body slightly out of rotation. And then with those two words, they just clicked into place. This was the moment where I knew, for whatever reason, by this man saying, go on, he was giving me permission. He wanted to be humiliated. He liked the fact that I called him gay and said something about finally getting rid of him. And there was no indication at any other point in my life that would have hinted that I would have known what to do in that moment. And yet, for whatever reason, I knew exactly what to do. And we proceeded to have the most honest 2-hour conversation that I think I've ever, had with anybody up until that point in my life, and certainly with him, where, he's saying all these words and I'm just madly Googling on my phone, like, what does Dom sub dynamic mean? What does sissification mean? What's a chastity belts? What's, all of these, what's a cuck? And so I'm reading all these things and rather than feeling, disgust or embarrassment or judgment, none of those things existed in me. The only thing that kept coming up was curiosity, intrigue, and this feeling that I was teetering on the edge of something that was deeply fulfilling and was going to be life-changing for me. And that for whatever reason, I was perfectly suited to go down into that world. And so going back to the visual of, going down this hallway and trying to open up all these doors, when those gears clicked into place, I felt like I heard a click and I looked down and there was a cellar door, so there I was looking for these doors that I could see. But meanwhile, it was like I had to go down into the darkest parts of myself to find the part of me that I had been looking for. And so at the end of this 2-hour conversation, he says, can I take you somewhere you've never been before? And I'm thinking, okay, we're going to go to a new restaurant that we haven't been to. And we're finally going to keep talking the way that we're talking now, which is actually honest and interesting. And I check my inbox and there's a ticket to Berlin for the next day. And so the next day, I'm in the backseat of an Uber on my way to the airport to go to Berlin for the first time to dom this man, Googling how to be a dominatrix. And
oh, wow.
All of these posts are popping up and, mind you, this was 7 years ago. So, you think there's a lack of information now. Imagine 7 years ago, how sparse this was. But, I kept coming across blog posts that more so talked about implements, how to use a cat o' nine tails properly, why not to use handcuffs in the bedroom, what is bondage, all these things, what rope to buy and what rope not to buy for your first time, all these things. And I'm like, okay, these are all the tools, but like, what does it actually mean psychologically, spiritually, emotionally to be a dom and to hold that? I was like, there must be more to it. And I thought about my life and I thought about, in a weird way, all of the things that had created the perfect, I guess, environment or circumstances to help me understand what it actually meant to be a responsible dom. And so much about that is attunement and perception and communication and compassion and non-judgmental behavior. And to really be able to hold someone in the narrow scope of your attention with love and curiosity and reflect them back to themselves and give them permission to be who they want to be in your eyes and in your present and through your direction and your leadership and through all of the things that I had been through in my life at that point. I knew that I had the core values of it, the very things that weren't actually being talked about at the time, or the information was really hard to find. And the only thing that I really had to do was then learn how to use the tools properly. And to this day, I teach that the most important tool is your voice and your sense of self. Everything else is secondary. But in that moment, in the backseat of that Uber, saying yes to this adventure, I promised that I would dedicate my life to teaching, first learning, then teaching, but always being curious about this world.
Wow. So it really felt almost like a calling when he said, go on. So what did you respond when he said, go on?
As soon as I didn't shut this person down, they completely opened up to me and started telling me about this world of BDSM and their particular kinks. And this man in particular is a very masculine looking man. I mean, by all accounts, you know, he's the kind of man where when he wears t-shirts, the t-shirt stretches across his, you know, broad sculpted chest. He has a chiseled jawline, you know, he has a buttery South African accent, you know, he has beautiful eyes and bone structure, and, you know, he's highly successful and he's a leader in his own regard. So physically he has all of these traits that would signal a masculine man, but he has a micro penis. He literally has a penis the size of a baby carrot. And he enjoyed, and in many ways, this is how he transmuted his shame, you could call it, into something that felt empowering. But he loved having his tiny penis called an enlarged clit. And he enjoyed if I, you know, tied a shoestring around it and then braided flowers through it, or have him prance around in frilly, very girly lingerie. Over the next 5 years, he loved me teaching him how to be a woman. And this was something where, rather than stewing in this feeling of, as a man, I'm not good enough in this one particular area of my sexuality, if I play into being a woman, then again, in this one area, I can feel like I'm celebrated rather than feel ashamed for what I have, or what I don't have. And so, you know, none of this, again, I knew at the time, I didn't know what sissification meant. Some people also say that sissification is a bit of a derogatory term, but I'm using it because that's the term.
Can you explain to people what that is?
It's a man essentially enjoying the feeling of being turned into a woman. And so this can be something that he willingly enjoys, or this can be forced sissification, which is when you, again, consensually allow your dom to forcefully turn you into a woman, and, you know, air quotes, against your will. You're not responsible for doing it. It's not a choice. It's something that your dom had you do. And, you know, I didn't think we'd get into rape fantasies and consensual non-consent so quickly, but while we're on this topic, you know, I will say that rape fantasies for many are, you know, very controversial, not in the sense that, you know, people have them at all, but the big question about, okay, well, why do so many people have them when it's such a traumatizing thing outside of a sexual fantasy? But I think what a lot of people don't understand is it's not the rape per se that people are fantasizing about, but it's the sensation of being overcome. It's the sensation of being forced into something against your will. And let me give an example. Let's say somebody grew up in an incredibly religious, strict household where any sexual act was looked down upon. If, like, they might have a fantasy or a kink around consensual non-consent because they won't feel the shame that they've done something wrong willingly if they were overcome and forced to do it. So in many ways, they get to straddle this line of full sexual expression and liberation and the sensation of doing something transgressive at the same time.
Yeah, that's interesting because I definitely feel identified with being turned on by, air quotes, that's an important part to say, like being forced to do something, right? Like something that, like we've talked about before, that I'm okay with, but that's kind of pushing my boundaries. And usually the way I play with it is, you know, I have to be turned on to a level, like you have to turn me on to a level where I'll allow you to do this thing that usually I wouldn't let other people do, right? But I think what you're talking about, it's a little bit different, right? Like it's more like, I don't want to feel responsible for having chosen this. And I want to at least pretend that I didn't choose it, although of course I did choose it, right? So I think that there's many very fascinating ways in which BDSM can play a role in kind of like scratching an itch, for lack of a better word. I do want to hear more about this sub. So okay, so you have a conversation. He tells you, I'm going to take you to Berlin and I want you to dominate me, basically, because I'm sensing that you have a knack for this somehow, and you are sensing it too. And now you're like, okay, I'm getting ready for this experience. What was the experience like?
Well, first of all, I made it very clear to him that this was my first experience. And I think that's really important for, maybe new doms to think about, which is that true dominance is not performance, and it's certainly not the performance of perfection. I think there's a misconception that in order to be a dom, you have to be perfect and you have to come from a place of the utmost confidence. And that's not necessarily true. Matter of fact, if you try to perform dominance, you're likely drawing from things outside of yourself that you've seen, and you're in many ways just acting dominance, but you're not embodying it. And that in many ways means that your attention is inward on yourself and not outward on your submissive. But you can think of dominance as attention outward, and you can think of submission as attention inward. So when you're a dom, your attention is going outward. It's not on yourself. Submission actually feels like the spiritual experience is actually going deeper into yourself. And I think that's in many ways why people can find truths that were maybe hidden from them through this experience of submission, because it's a deep experience of trust and surrender, and that's done relationally. So that's done in the presence and the attention of another person. And there's something about being witnessed in your desires and your desires coming true that allows for that inner work, that inner experience. So I go to Berlin, and I've made it clear that this is my first experience with being a dom. And, I just kind of said to myself, only do what feels true. So don't pretend and don't act like what you think a dom should look like. And if I had, to be honest, I would have probably almost acted maybe aggressively, or I would have maybe acted masculine in many ways, because I think for myself at that time, and for many women, we think of dominance, and we think of maybe the archetype of a strong, confident, assertive, potentially aggressive man. But dominance can be really soft, and it can be really feminine, and it can be direct, but it doesn't have to be harsh. Sometimes it can be, and that's what's required, and that's what's desired by the submissive, but it doesn't have to be. And so finding your unique expression of dominance actually is a process of finding what feels true to you as a leader. And so my first act of dominance was something that felt true to me and quite simple. I had asked him to, put me on the top floor of this beautiful hotel, the Mikolberger Hotel in Berlin, and put himself in a shoebox, essentially, on the bottom floor. And so I wanted to first establish this feeling that, I was the queen and worshiping, and I was above him, and, he was below me. And that if I wanted something, he had to come all the way up to give it to me. And so I was reading on the bed. I was reading this book of erotic poetry on the bed. I just had a bath, and I left the water in the bathtub. And I texted him and I said, come upstairs. And, I had already kind of unlatched the door, so it was just resting on itself so that I could be like perfectly laid out on the bed reading this book when he came in. And that felt fun and playful to me. And he walks in, and I don't look up from the book, and I just say, drain my bath water. He says, yes, Queen Nicolle. And he goes over to the bathtub and he sticks his hand in kind of the cold water at that point, and he stands there and he waits for the bathtub to drain. And, mind you, he had to come up quite a far distance to get to my hotel room. And then he says, is there anything else I can do for you? And again, without looking up from the book and making eye contact with him, almost as if he's inconsequential, I said, no, that will be all. You can leave now. And there was just something so, he wanted so much in that moment, and I just didn't give it to him. And I proved in that moment that I was controlling the pacing, and that my confidence was coming from not needing to prove to him that I could be this powerful dom, but that I was in control of how much he got and when. And, as soon as he left the room and the door latched behind him, I just put my face down into the book, and I was like, oh my God, I did it. But I remember this power moving through my body of just being like, that was me just using my voice. And it was such an exciting moment for me, because again, I wasn't trying to act in any certain way. I was just being what was true to me. And, we, over the course of our time in Berlin, we tried a bunch of different things, and then we came back, and we were both living in Toronto at the time. And it was really the beginning of what was quite a long and beautiful relationship. And, that's the difference between a lifestyle dom, which I was for many years, and a professional dom. So a professional dom will typically work out of a dungeon, or they'll do, house calls, or they'll have a private practice at their own home. But they take on clients, and, those clients are with them for a set amount of time. Let's call it an hour. They have a negotiated pay. They have, negotiated activities that they'll do or they won't do. And then in many circumstances, those clients of theirs will be forbidden from contacting them outside of the hours that they're specifically getting paid for. A lifestyle dom typically means that your submissives are more integrated into your life. Some doms have full-on romantic relationships with their submissives. Or for me, I had my submissives pay me a flat rate per month, and we would text, I don't want to say constantly to give the impression that I was available at all times, but we had more of an ongoing connection and ongoing dynamic and communication. And there are pros and cons to both. One of the downfalls of being a lifestyle dom is that the lines can become really blurry between what constitutes a actual relationship and what can be contained in the box of, BDSM or a transactional relationship. So, one of my submissives in particular really fell in love with me. And once we transitioned out of me being his dom and him being my sub, we had a bit of a difficult time actually just being friends. And it was kind of this awkward, strange experience where he naturally wanted to fall into being my submissive. And I was like, we're not doing that anymore. And so that would just be something to consider if someone is seriously thinking about whether they want to be a lifestyle dom or they want to be a professional.
Yeah, got it. So another question I have in that case with this person, for example, were you then okay, now that I'm doing this for you, I want you to start paying me? Were you also having sex with him, or was it just kink play dynamic?
Most doms, and I can say this with confidence, generally don't have sex with their clients. There is a misconception that BDSM essentializes sex. And I would actually say the opposite, which is that it de-essentializes sex, specifically penetrative sex. And for many people, that actually creates a pocket of eroticism and safety, because sex, even in a sexual context, is not the point. The point is intense sensations, complex role play, and playing with power dynamics that allow you to vocalize your desires and have them met with enthusiasm. So if I were to boil it down, I would actually say BDSM is more about play than it is about sex.
Got it. So tell me about this, how your relationship evolved with this submissive, and also what was it that you were getting from this experience, right? What was it besides eventually the money, but you weren't thinking about that at that point, that was so enticing for you?
I started charging right from the beginning, so I never allowed us to slip into something where I wasn't receiving financial compensation. At first, it was things like trips and food and having my rent covered. And then it was all of those things plus just a flat rate per month that made me feel like whatever time and attention I was giving this person was worth it for me. So that's on the financial side of things. But I think you bring up a really good point and ask a great question around what else was I getting out of it. And that kind of brings me to some of the points that I talk about in my book, where I outline some of the ways that BDSM can make you a better leader and a better lover. So this applies to someone who is both in the dominant role and the submissive role. So one of the things is that you have to become brutally honest about who you are. So BDSM doesn't actually allow you to stay vague about your needs or to hide behind charm or good intentions. Often we move through life and our relationships with a certain sense of ambiguity in many of our dynamics, many of our relationships, many of our conversations. But BDSM, and specifically dominance and submission, you're forced to play very distinct roles. So there can be no collapsing of the roles. Almost think of it as two poles, like two magnets, it's positive and the negative. You need someone to be in the dominant role and you need someone to be in the submissive role. This lack of ambiguity is actually really important, like I said, because it does not allow you to stay vague. You have to know what you want, or sometimes it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily know what you want, but you know what you would like to potentially try, and that might inch you closer and closer to really having a breakthrough. Or you know what you don't want, and knowing what you don't want is, I would say, almost more important than knowing what you do want. I always like to think of, first of all, one, the things that you don't want. I always like to ask, well, how do you know you don't want that? Now, that's not me pushing back against you and saying, oh, I think I know better. But I want to be clear on how you know that it's something you don't want. Did you have a traumatic experience with this particular activity? Is this something that, you saw happen somewhere else and you recoiled? Like, did you see it in a movie and it didn't end well? Like, what is actually there that's prohibiting you from wanting that thing? Because what's really interesting is sometimes there's shame there, and sometimes moving towards the shame is actually what is going to help you unlock something within yourself that is either unhealed or is deeply erotic and can be potentially very fulfilling. Now, trust is built over time, and a dom has the ethical responsibility to listen to the submissive, and this is why we do negotiation. And the second thing I'll say on kind of knowing what you want or what you don't want is, rather than just listing through all of these activities, oh, do you want to be flogged? Do you want to be bound? Do you want to be gagged? Do you, all of these things. The activity is really just the stand-in or the physical expression of a sensation that this person might want to experience. So rather than just listing off, do you want this activity or this, try to find out how they want to feel or how they don't want to feel. Is humiliation an erotic sensation for them? Do they actually enjoy the sensation of shame in their body? All of these are sensations in the body that we've deemed taboo that we then move away from. But for some people, shame, and is a sensation in the body that they actually find deeply arousing. I'm one of those people. For me, shame feels more like a weightlessness, and it shuts down my kind of overthinking mind, and it allows me to almost have a suspension of my identity. I call many of these activities in BDSM the temporary suspension from the burden of selfhood. And this is kind of a classic way of looking at masochism as well, which is that when you experience humiliation in real life, it's a threat to your social status. But when you experience the sensation of humiliation in a safe environment, in a scene, you still get that like whooshing feeling of being exposed, or, you know, the ground opening up and you kind of sinking down into it, or you like wanting to shrink yourself so tiny that you could hide beneath a shoe, right? It's like, for some people, that sensation in their body is actually the very thing that allows them to have an out-of-body experience, or have it enter into an altered state where there's no negative long-term repercussions in their actual life, but they still get the sensation of humiliation that they crave.
I like what you say about, instead of focusing on the practical aspect of it, thinking about the psychological aspect, right? I think personally, I could say, I want you to edge me and then force me to do a particular thing that I don't like to do in normal circumstances, right? But that's not really telling anyone why I find that arousing, right? But then when I like got into it, I'm like, okay, I find it arousing because I like the idea that you are like not forcing me, but that you make me so horny that I do anything for you, especially things that I would normally not do if I wasn't that horny. So it's interesting too, because in a way, even though I'm the submissive, I'm also kind of like challenging the dominant to be like, you have to make me horny enough for you to earn the power to do this to me, right? So understanding that, I think it's more important. And to your point too, of how you can do certain things that you cannot do, or that, you know, in real life is a completely different experience, right? I deal with like guilt a lot, right? So if I do something that I'm not supposed to be doing because it's not good for me or whatever, or because it doesn't feel like it's honoring me, I feel guilty in regular life, right? But in a play space, if I did something where I feel like this person made me, again, air quotes, do this thing that I wasn't supposed to, and like I'm being, you know, a bad girl, that's arousing, because again, there's no repercussions to it, right? But in real life, there are repercussions to it. So I totally resonate with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. And in, let's say, something along those similar lines is, you know, the brat is one expression of submission. What does the brat really want? The brat enjoys the dom almost proving themselves to the brat. The brat wants to submit, but they want to almost feel submission through being punished, or it actually looks like being ignored. If a sub enjoys the sensation of rejection or neglect, it's a sensation that they like in their body. Again, a typical taboo thing, a taboo emotion that we're meant to ignore. Or in real life, if you actually experience neglect and rejection, these aren't good things. But in a sexual circumstance, through BDSM, through a scene, if you like those feelings, then if your dom ignores you, you get to experience neglect and rejection in a safe container of knowing that they're actually giving you the feeling that you want. And now, this is where I think that BDSM in many ways can be incredibly therapeutic. You likely won't subconsciously go create scenarios in your everyday life where you get access to that feeling, because in many ways you're getting your fix of that feeling in a safe container.
Oh.
So, right. So there's this Jungian quote that's popular. it's bastardized often, and I'm probably going to do it myself right now. And I've read in a couple of places that it's actually not even him who said it, but let me give you the overview, okay, people, and then you can go find the direct quote. But it's this: if you're not aware of yourself and your own desires, especially the ones that are taboo, that we tend to repress, you will subconsciously create scenarios in your life where you can get access to that feeling, and you will call it fate. This is what I actually think the power of BDSM is in its, let's call it, therapeutic application, which is that there is finally a place where you can get that sensation that you want, and you're not going to go out and create a situation that then just gives you that feeling that you're actually truly craving because it's erotic to you. And what's erotic is the feeling of being alive. Many people will say eroticism is life force energy. Arousal is life force energy. So imagine if someone has this kink where they enjoy the sensation of rejection, humiliation, guilt, shame, all these things. If they don't have access to that sensation in their body, they're going to be rejecting a part of themselves that truly makes them feel alive. You stop fighting parts of yourself. BDSM gives those parts somewhere to exist without taking control over your life or leaking out sideways. And so when you stop judging those parts of yourself, and equally, if not more powerfully, someone else witnesses you in that and doesn't judge you, those parts of yourself stop running the show, right? So in many ways, you've actually become more stable. You could say you become more whole. You do not necessarily become more extreme. If anything, you know yourself better because you accept all sides of yourself. And so, this is BDSM can be looked at in many ways as shadow play. You're learning to work with your shadows. You're learning to work with the parts of yourself that you've rejected.
But why would someone want that? Because, for example, with the sub that you were talking about, maybe, well, I don't know, I'm making assumptions here, but maybe he wanted that because he had that, because maybe he encountered women that made fun of his penis or something, or whatever, or boys when he was young. And then he got used to that in a weird way. So then wouldn't you say oh, but isn't it? And again, I'm kind of playing the devil's advocate because I know that that's not quite what it is, but isn't that kind of unhealthy that because he maybe got used to that feeling of humiliation, now he needs to stay in that place and even hire someone to humiliate him? You know what I mean?
This is something that I talk about in my book and on my Substack, especially because one of the things that I focus on is the therapeutic potential of BDSM. And that all goes back to the question, could it ever be a form of therapy in and of itself? This is a great question. So there's a few ways to look at it. One of them is imagine if he had no place to experience, not humiliation, because remember that in this circumstance, in many ways, there was a celebration around his tiny penis, right? So counterbalanced to the general feeling that he got when, again, he looks quite masculine. And so he would attract women who then assumed that he would have a large penis, certainly not a micro penis. Let's just put it that way. So the disappointment that he would see on women's faces over and over and over again, either when he told them ahead of time or when they were in a sexual situation and they discovered it themselves, imagine if he didn't have a counterbalance to that sensation. Imagine if he didn't have a place to go where he could have his micro penis celebrated and honored as being a giant clit. Imagine if he never had a place where he could experience a sensation in his body related to his tiny penis that actually made him feel good about it. That means he would just be condemned to go his entire life with this one association with it. The second thing is being able to feel powerful and like it's a choice. So he can't change his micro penis, but he can change how he sees it. And through
Yeah.
BDSM, through these scenes, he's able to, in many ways, take control over something that is otherwise uncontrollable by allowing himself to be exposed to a space and to an identity. So remember, when he's sissified, he's not the powerful CEO with a small penis. He's this beautiful woman prancing around in expensive lingerie who has a enlarged clit that everyone's jealous of because it can experience more pleasure than anybody else. Right.
Right. So it's like a fantasy world that takes you away from your regular persona, right? Which is why you see a lot of super successful CEOs wanting to be submissive, because in their regular life, they're always in charge, right? And it's finding that contrast to desires that they might have because they cannot experience them in regular life, you know?
Exactly. And while we're on this topic, let me go through a few of the things that make BDSM therapeutic. So we're not pretending that BDSM in and of itself is therapy, but many people who engage in BDSM would say that it has been therapeutic for them. And these are some of the things that I hear the most. So you experience vulnerability that doesn't actually end badly. So for a lot of people, being open or exposed has historically led to shame, rejection, or harm. Specifically for survivors of sexual assault, there is an incredible power in a scene that reenacts the traumatic experience, but they are in control of changing the ending. And they get to experience a sensation in their body of the ending being differently, of their voice being honored, and of their body being safe. So in BDSM, that level of vulnerability is planned to the T and taken very seriously. And when it's done well, the body gets a new message that intensity does not automatically mean danger, and that they are in control of their experience. And that can quietly, subtly, through repetition or through one amazing experience, undo a lot of old patterning around trust and closeness and autonomy. And the last one is that there's power in chosen intensity and chosen identity. So in many ways, we all have some sort of identity imposed upon us, or an identity that we have through life raised ourselves up into. You brought up the kind of this trope of the CEO who longs to submit. Well, there's a reason why that's so familiar. And it really is true that high caliber men tend to want to submit. Not all the time. There's also many other men across the economic spectrum who also desire to submit. And it has nothing to do with wanting to relinquish control or power only because that's something that they experience all the time. There's other really powerful benefits to a man in particular submitting, but strong sensations and deep focus can shift your mental state. So the difference is choice and how you associate to yourself. You enter into a scene on purpose. You enter into a dynamic on purpose with boundaries, negotiations, trust, consent, and you come back safely. And so for people who have felt overwhelmed or powerless in the past or feel stuck in one identity, that really matters and can make a big difference. It restores a sense of agency. It allows you to experience a different side of yourself, and you're not at the mercy of your emotions or your past, but you're actually participating in the reinforcement of this new expression of self that you might not have access to in your everyday life.
Thank you for explaining all that. We could really have like 4 episodes on this topic because I have so much to say. Given we can't do 4 episodes right now, let's move on to your non-monogamous journey, because I know that you are currently in a monogamous relationship, but you did try polyamory. So I'm always curious, because even I myself have doubts, even in this moment, of whether I want to be poly, because yes, in theory, I love connecting with different people and all of that, but the emotional labor that comes with it can feel like a lot and felt like a lot to me, and especially after my recent breakup with my secondary partner. So I'm curious what your experience was like, being someone who's obviously very into exploration, a very curious person, into BDSM. You have all these traits that you might think like, oh, poly would make sense for you, but you've made this conscious decision not to choose it, even though you had desire at some point to experience it. So tell me how your journey into E&M started.
Well, I met my primary partner while I already had two submissives. And at that point in my early exploration of being a dom, it felt that I had discovered a part of myself that had been missing my entire life. And so the thought of giving that up, he saw the DS dynamics as relationships and wanted me to end them and commit fully to him. But at the time, and maybe this should have been a warning sign early on, but my intuition and my instincts were saying, that's a bad deal. You don't want to give up this part of yourself. It would actually feel like cutting off a limb. And at the time, I most definitely felt that it was actually part of my sexual expression, and that giving it up would be like cutting off a limb. And again, the second part was that there was a part of me that fundamentally didn't trust them. And so it was actually terrifying to me to think about putting all of my sexual attention and devotion into this relationship with this one person. And so I pushed back against it and therefore set the tone for the rest of the relationship, which is that we were going to be open. I actually didn't identify as poly for many years in that relationship. I didn't feel that I was capable of having my heart truly love more than one person. For me, again, with the lifestyle dom work, it still felt like there were these boundaries, especially around emotions and commitment to these people. But my primary partner really leaned into poly. And so he would come home every few weeks and tell me he was in love with a new person. Meanwhile, on occasion, I would, feel an arousal with somebody, or we went to a lot of play parties and I hosted a lot of play parties as well. And that would be kind of my place to explore and play. But that's really as far as it went for me. What is more interesting, I think, is the tension that I eventually started to feel in that relationship when I did meet a couple that I fell in love with. And they did polyamory so well. I always say that I got the gold standard. I got the premium experience of being in a polyamorous throuple. And it actually illuminated to me just how toxic my primary partnership was. And so I was living on the absolute edges of these two extremes. One, just a terrible experience with polyamory. Everything that you could do wrong in a polyamorous relationship, I experienced with this person. I certainly didn't do everything perfectly either. I can take responsibility for that. But there was a lot of pain and a lot of drama all the time. And then I also got to experience myself in this really, really healthy dynamic with this couple, with a man and a woman. And that dynamic actually helped me realize that I didn't want polyamory at all. It's funny. It wasn't the problematic dynamic that did it. It was actually the wonderful dynamic that did it, because I said to myself at the end of it, if this is the best that it can be, and this is amazing, why do I still feel like it's actually not for me? It's kind of like getting your dream job and then realizing that you've worked your whole life to reach this point, and you get there and there's something missing and you realize it's not for you. Now, what a blessing to have the experience of actually getting what you thought you wanted, only to realize you don't want it. And at the same time, what a heartbreaking and shattering and difficult thing, especially if you've spent years in that kind of situation or working towards that. it really can threaten your sense of identity and almost your inner compass to feel like, how was I led astray by myself for so long? But polyamory gave me in many ways excellent communication, language, a much sharper kind of relationship toolkit. I learned how to name needs. I learned how to negotiate boundaries. So when I picture, when I picture the version of love that actually makes me feel anchored, it's not a life of constant negotiation with multiple partners. It's not trying to pretend that jealousy is somehow a base, brute emotion that I'm meant to bludgeon out of me through exposure. Like, I realize that I'm not a person who wants to obliterate hierarchy, that I actually want to be the number one person in somebody's life as a non-negotiable. And so, you use the word conscious when you ask me this question, you kind of set it up for me. I think there is something really beautiful about conscious monogamy. So not just prescribing to monogamy because it's the thing that societally you think that you're supposed to do, but making the actual choice to enter into a monogamous relationship. There's a psychologist named Dr. Tammy Nelson, and she talks about the new monogamy. And she kind of argues that monogamy in and of itself is not the problem. Unconscious monogamy is. And so that many couples inherit a script and they never discuss what, fidelity actually means. They don't talk about betrayal. They don't really talk about how waning desire will be handled long term. They don't talk about rupture and repair. And what she says is that unexamined monogamy is actually the issue that erodes a relationship long term, but that new monogamy is a conscious and negotiated devotion, and that it's couples who are actively designing their agreements and then periodically checking in on those agreements rather than assuming default roles that can lead to an expression of monogamy that is actually exciting and healthy, and that can be fully sexually exclusive without feeling like you're missing out on either erotic exploration or some sort of deep connection. Because I really do believe that that's a big draw for a lot of people into polyamory, which is that you can kind of follow these threads of desire and arousal to their eventual conclusion rather than feeling like you have to be in a conversation with someone and it's getting kind of flirty. And then you have to go, oh, by the way, I'm in a monogamous relationship. Like, we cannot continue. So yeah, there's pros and cons to both.
Yeah, no, I totally relate to that. It's like, is it worth the effort for you, right? I think that, as you said, the issue is when you don't examine it, but often we examine it and then we're like, it doesn't make sense. Monogamy doesn't make sense. I'm attracted to other people. Let me act on that attraction. But then the reality of acting on that attraction, yes, comes with sexual exploration, self-discovery, this and that. But as you said, it comes with constant conversations. It comes with jealousy. It comes with a lot of things that you also have to consciously choose if you want to be poly. And a lot of people choose, and that's great, but it's not for everyone. And a lot of people try it thinking it's for them. And then once they're in there, it's like hard to kind of go back because you're like, I've already had that freedom. I've already had that opportunity to connect sexually with whoever I want. And going back feels like going back into a box. And I do feel like there are some people who find a way to make it sustainable. But the other day, a friend told me, another friend who's also having doubts about poly was like, what person do you know that's doing poly well? That's not their whole identity. And then I thought about it and I was like, you know what? That's kind of true. Like, the people that I can think of that are doing poly well, it's not like it's their whole identity, but I can tell that they spend a significant amount of time doing that. And that time is a time that you can use on other things, right? So for you, for example, so was this couple non-hierarchical? I like to be in a hierarchical relationship because I feel like otherwise every single event or whatever. It's like, who's going to go, or every single thing. It's a conversation. And I'm just like, I just like to know who's my person, whose person I am. And we don't need to, we minimize the amount of conversations, which are already a lot, you know what I mean? But what was if you could maybe tell us a little bit more of like your experience with that and with having those conversations and realizing actually I can't be bothered to be non-hierarchical or poly to begin with.
Well, to first comment on what you just said, I think there's an appeal to chosen monogamy as well, as that it does reduce the variables while increasing depth. And it also does it without pretending that there is one correct template on how to do a relationship. So if almost we looked at monogamy, the conscious monogamy as customized monogamy, I think that might help some people recognize that there is such a level of depth that comes from someone's true devotion and attention on you and only you. There is an instability naturally that comes with knowing that your partner could walk back through the door after a date with somebody and tell you that, you know, they're really, really into this person and they want to continue spending more time with them. The dynamic, to answer your question, whether or not it was hierarchical. So, you know, I had my primary partner. So in many ways, he was prioritized. Then this relationship with the couple, when I met them, they were already in a relationship with each other. She was his submissive, but they also had a romantic partnership. And then I kind of began having a relationship with him, and then kind of started having a relationship with her. And then we were like, wait a second, why don't we all just have a relationship together? But then she also had a relationship with another man that they had been in a relationship with for like 10 years. And then he also started to have other partners too. And so it's like, just, you know, I wasn't part of their spreadsheets, but they had scheduling spreadsheets. And I think that is, that can really work for some people. And, you know, polyamory does require strong emotional skills, emotional regulation, communication, boundaries, clarity, honest self-knowledge, a secure attachment foundation for the most part. But under modern stress, people are already overwhelmed. And yes, it's kind of funny that you say it becomes someone's entire personality. It's like, for many people, doing one relationship well, and I'm not even talking about kids in the picture yet, but doing one relationship well is already a lot of work. Now you want to add in 2, 3 more dynamics and paramours and your partner having another partner and this like constantly shifting foundation. I think it can be, you know, and this kind of brings me to my second point, and I'll preface by giving my own story, but polyamory can also become an incredibly seductive form of intimacy avoidance. And when I finally ended my incredibly complex, difficult, complicated, and toxic primary partnership, it left a void. And my submissives rushed in to try to fill that void, and my other partners, you know, tried to fill that void. And I just realized that this void was something that I had been avoiding, and it wasn't going to get filled by these other relationships, because these other relationships in many ways were a byproduct of what I was avoiding, which is that I was fundamentally unhappy and distressed because of all of the reasons why I was unhappy in this primary partnership, and that it was doomed to fail. So I do think that polyamory can in many ways serve as a loophole for avoiding core intimacy work, or confronting a truth that the relationship is not working, and that you are actually looking outside of the relationship to get access to all of the things that you're not getting with this one person.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have to continue in part 2, but given that we talked about BDSM, that we talked about non-monogamy, my last, I guess, double question to you is, where do you stand today? You mentioned before we started recording that you are not a lifestyle dom anymore. I don't know what your sexual dynamic, and I think that's another misconception, right? That people have, that lifestyle doms are doms in their sexual dynamic with their romantic partners. And I don't know where you fall in that spectrum. So I'd be curious to hear a little bit about that. But more generally, what does your relationship to BDSM and to monogamy look like today? And also, given your journey with those two, what would you tell to our listeners? I usually say, what would you tell to a polycurious person? But I guess in this instance, what would you tell a polycurious person or a BDSM curious person?
So where I'm at with BDSM is that although I'm not practicing it as a lifestyle dom with submissives, it's still very much part of who I am. Not only my dominant self, but also my submissive self, which I had the great pleasure of experiencing in a really healthy way with that couple that I was in a polyamorous relationship with. So I had never explored submission before in a way that felt deeply fulfilling and nourishing. And so I didn't actually even know the power of it. And so I actually think that people who are submissive also make excellent doms.
That's good news to me.
Right. Good news. And people who start off as subs or who have only been subs tend to feel unqualified to lead. And in reality, the opposite is often true, because people who have submitted understand what unsafe power feels like. So hesitation moving from being submissive into being a dom is not weakness. It's actual ethical awareness of the responsibility of holding such power and leading. And so even though I'm not practicing these things in a paid context, they're still very much integrated into not only who I am, so how I move through the world, even when I'm not in a sexual scenario of dominance and submission, but it's now something I've been able to bring into my relationship. So my current partner, who I'm in a monogamous relationship with that feels deeply fulfilling to me, we experiment and play with BDSM, and I get to explore submission. And in many ways, I'm leading him, but from the submissive standpoint. And so I'm helping to elevate him into being a dom. And it's like Build-A-Bear, or like the perfect customization of my ideal dom, because it's like he's learning it through me, and I wouldn't have been able to teach him what it is that I actually want in a dom if I wasn't doing it from the submissive standpoint. And then also as a dom, I have that awareness and knowledge. And so I can speak to him from both sides. I can speak to him as a submissive, and I can also speak to him as a dom, and I can really teach him, and he's super receptive to it. And what's really fun is I've been able to be very candid about that I need access to that dominant side of me. And so he is really receptive as well to exploring submission. And so what I think is going to end up happening is, both through our mutual openness and through my knowledge and his curiosity and eagerness in many ways, we're going to create a really cool switchy dynamic. And what's so fun about that is it makes me feel that in one relationship, I can access all sides of me. So it almost makes me feel like I'm dating more than one person, because we get to go into these kind of other modes, and we get to play in these other modes, and it just becomes so fluid and natural. You know, our structure is monogamy, and our communication is so good that, you know, we share with each other if we feel a little bit flirty with somebody. And again, whether or not we stay purely monogamous for the amount of time that we're together, and, you know, right now, as far as we're both concerned and the way that our lives are going and the devotion we feel towards one another, we're speaking as if we will stay together forever. And so with that level of devotion, we also understand that life is long, and maybe there'll be some adjustments along the way, but creating a foundation of deep trust through devotion, through monogamy, is what we both feel is right now, especially if we ever want side quests. So that's where I'm at. And in terms of BDSM and in terms of my relationship, for somebody who is polycurious, a conversation that I find myself having with most people who do ask me about my journey with polyamory, one person in the relationship tends to want to open up the relationship first. Rarely I've found is it, both people kind of come to that same conclusion at the same time. And of course, this is people who, let's say, start off in monogamous relationships and then one person wants to change the agreement. And that can be really devastating for the person who's on the receiving end of that to hear it, because they might feel to themselves, well, am I not enough? Am I not worth it? And they might feel a sense of lack. And that can be really hard, and it can cause somebody to really want to shut down. I think the beginning of that conversation really needs to start with a reassurance and intention. Like, what is the true intention of wanting to open up the relationship? And if the intention is not to funnel more energy, love, and eroticism back into the primary relationship, you really have to make that clear. Otherwise, it can really come across as deceptive. So, why do you want to engage in polyamory? Like, is it that do you want to just sleep with other people? What kind of boundaries are you going to create around emotions and whether someone gets attached or not? When you say polyamory, you are saying multi-love. Are you then desiring to have full-on relationships with other people? Do you expect to eventually move in with them? Like, how can we make sure that we feel we're on the same page as this progresses? I think that's a really important part of the conversation to have, is like, is this for us? And how will this improve and enhance our dynamic? And how will we navigate some of the difficulties that will come up around, jealousy, for instance, or worthiness, that are, I think, quite natural things to experience, especially if you're moving from what you thought was one relationship structure into another.
So don't do it to save their relationship.
No, that's like the equivalent of having kids to try to save the relationship. It's like if you're using polyamory to try to save the relationship, you need to be really clear about, and it's hard and it's scary to be clear. And if it's really that you just want to have sex with other people, if you're bringing this up because there's actually like some guy in accounting that you're like, I've been fantasizing about him, I actually want to experience what it might be like to have sex with this person. Like, just be really honest about that. Obviously polyamory and ethical non-monogamy has come up a lot over the last few years, especially. It's become kind of trendy in some ways. And so maybe you heard about it and you heard all the good things, but you also need to know the risks. The last thing I'll say on this particular point is that it is possible to get cheated on in a polyamorous relationship or in an open relationship, and that can be incredibly isolating. It's something that happened to me in my primary relationship. It's incredibly devastating. I found out that he had been talking to this woman behind my back for like 7 months, telling each other they loved each other, making plans to go traveling together, sending naked photos back and forth, whatever. It was devastating because I'm like, dude, like, why are you doing this? Like, we're supposed to be able to have this open communication. There's literally no reason for you to hide this from me. And I felt like I couldn't talk to anybody about it because it's like, oh, well, you're in an open relationship. Aren't you allowed to do whatever it is that you want to do? So I kind of kept quiet about it and felt really isolated and almost ashamed of the fact that it had happened. Just know that without clear communication and boundaries, you can feel betrayed in your open relationship in the same way that you would getting cheated on in a monogamous relationship.
Yeah, 100%. Well, thank you so much, Nicolle. It's been so great to have you. I'll make sure to add all of those links to your Substack, to your Instagram, to your book when it's out, everything in the episode description. But thank you so much for being with me here today.
Thank you.